The hum of the fluorescent lights above me faded into the background as I sat in the cracked beige vinyl chair of the waiting area, the kind that squeaks every time you shift your weight, the kind that has seen decades of bored customers flipping through outdated car magazines with oil-stained covers and wrinkled pages curled at the corners. But I wasn't reading today. I was watching through the wide glass pane that separated the customer area from the garage, where Travis was tightening the bolts on the lift arms and securing my car before pressing the button that raised it slowly into the air with a mechanical groan that made me hold my breath without knowing why. He didn't speak as he worked, but I saw how his eyes flicked toward the side window of the shop, just enough to catch the distorted outline of my silhouette reflected against the sun-streaked glass, and for a moment I wondered if he was checking on the lift or checking on me. Though I told myself it didn't matter because I was just here for car trouble, just like last time, just like any other customer. Except it wasn't just like last time. Not really, because 3 months ago, during a routine oil change, when the hood was still up and I was standing closer than I usually would, trying to understand what he meant about the gasket or the belt or whatever he'd said was causing that whirring sound, he had reached down to grab a rag and in the process, his hand brushed against my knee, not sharply, not obviously, just enough to notice, and then without a pause or a glance, he wiped his greasy fingers on the hem of my summer dress, quick and absent-minded like it was the most natural motion in the world. And while I had laughed it off back then, chalking it up to a mechanic's forgetfulness or maybe just poor aim, I hadn't stopped replaying that second in my mind since. It wasn't the touch that stayed with me so much as the question of whether he had even realized what he was doing or if he had done it precisely because I hadn't moved away. Because I had frozen, surprised, and maybe just curious enough not to say anything at all. And now, as I watched him from behind the safety of the glass, I realized that moment had never really left me. It had simply lodged itself somewhere deep, quiet, like a stone at the bottom of a well that only rippled when someone dropped another into the water. At home, things were much quieter in all the wrong ways, and my husband Brian, for all his careful routines and lists and color-coded calendars taped to the side of the fridge, hadn't looked me in the eyes in weeks, maybe months, unless he needed to confirm if the recycling was being picked up on Wednesday, or if I had ordered the replacement filter for the air purifier. And even then, it was more of a glance than a gaze, as though meeting my eyes might knock him off balance and send everything else. His strict meal prep schedule, his YouTube tutorials on maximizing washer efficiency, spiraling out of order. The night before I returned to the shop, we had argued over which washing machine to get, a conversation that started with prices but ended with silence, as most of our disagreements did. And while he paced the kitchen reading specs off his phone in that tight, clipped tone of someone trying very hard to stay calm, I caught myself thinking about how Travis would probably have said something like, "Just pick the damn thing, they all do the same job." And I hated how comforting that idea felt, how tempting that shrug-it-off freedom sounded in contrast to Brian's constant analysis. So when I scheduled the next visit to the shop, I didn't tell Brian. I simply said I'd handle it because it was easier, faster, made more sense for my schedule, and because I didn't want to admit, even to myself, that I wanted to see if Travis would look at me the same way again, or say something, or maybe not say anything at all, but still find a way to stand just a little too close. When I arrived at the garage that morning, Travis barely nodded, just gestured toward my car and muttered, "Strange noise again?" Like it was some inside joke between us, one I hadn't quite been let in on yet. And then, with his back still to me, he added, "Are you sure you want me to fix it this time?" In a voice that didn't match the words, low and almost teasing, though I wasn't sure if I was imagining that, or if he was really daring me to notice the way he said want. I hesitated, then said yes, because what else could I say? And without looking up, he pressed the control to raise the car again, motioning for me to get in if I wanted to feel what he meant, which made no real sense but also didn't need. 2, because somehow it sounded like a challenge, like I was being offered something I could still turn down if I really wanted to, only I didn't. The lift began its climb, and I stayed inside the car, letting it rise until the walls of the garage became something I could no longer see clearly, only sense. And then, after a long pause, the driver's door opened and Travis climbed in, his movement slow and deliberate, not hesitant but not rushed, either. And when he settled into the passenger seat, the air between us felt compressed, thick, like an attic with no window, full of dust and forgotten heat. He didn't speak, didn't glance my way, just let the silence stretch as he reached over me, his fingers grazing the latch of the glove box with what felt like far too much intention. Because when his knuckles brushed my thigh, I didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't even breathe differently, and he didn't pull back, didn't apologize, just let the glove box fall open like we were checking something inside when both of us knew we weren't. I didn't look at him, but I felt his closeness in the way my body stilled. Not in fear, but in something else I couldn't name, something like readiness. There was something about the way the air felt inside that lifted car, suspended just above the ordinary world, as though the garage floor beneath us had vanished and we were floating somewhere outside of rules and routines, the kind of space where time doesn't tick but waits, heavy and expectant, where even silence seems to echo, like a held breath that neither of us wanted to be the first to release. Travis didn't say anything, but his elbow was barely an inch from mine, and I could feel the heat radiating off his arm like the warmth left in the sun-drenched leather seats of an old car after a long drive, and the scent in the cabin had changed too. It wasn't just the faint traces of oil or rubber or gasoline anymore, but something else entirely, something sharper and cleaner, maybe cologne or maybe just the way his skin smelled when it had been working all morning, layered with effort and something dangerously human. When his fingers finally retreated from the glove box, they brushed the inside edge of my thigh again. Not hard, not rushed, just enough to say he could, just enough to see if I'd move. And I didn't. Not out of fear. Not because I didn't register it, but because I couldn't figure out if I wanted to stop it or wanted it to happen again. Maybe even more deliberately this time, because my heart wasn't pounding the way it would if I were afraid. It was beating slow and deep like the bass of a song you've known your whole life but never listened to with your eyes closed. He didn't ask me why I hadn't waited in the lobby, and I didn't ask him why he joined me inside the car because both questions were bridges we didn't need to cross yet, not when it felt like we were still on the edge, testing the strength of what might hold or what might snap if either of us leaned too far into it. When the lift descended and the wheels finally touched down, there was a moment where I expected him to say something, anything, maybe even a joke, to make the tension feel like it had been a misunderstanding. Like I was just another customer and not a woman who had let a stranger's hands get that close without a flinch. But he said nothing, just stepped out with the same quiet precision he'd used to enter, leaving the driver's door open behind, him like a breath half drawn and never released. I sat there a moment longer, hands still in my lap, skin still tingling in the places where his fingers had passed, trying to remember when exactly this stopped being about a noise in the steering column and became about something else entirely, something I wasn't sure I had language for yet. At home later that night, the house smelled like lemon disinfectant, and the kind of quiet that hums just loud enough to remind you something's missing. And Brian was standing in the kitchen, measuring detergent into a cup with the same care he used to check the tire pressure before a road trip. And when I walked in, he looked up briefly before returning his attention to the washer drum like it held answers he still hadn't found. He was talking about features and reviews and load capacities, but all I could hear was how far his voice felt from me, how long it had been since he'd asked how my day was, or noticed that my hair was different, or that I'd worn perfume I hadn't touched in months. The one he used to say made me smell like summer nights in Sonoma, back when we still laughed over wine we couldn't afford and kissed in parking lots, just because we could. Somewhere between rinse cycles and water efficiency, I thought about Travis again, about the way he hadn't filled the space with talk or forced his presence into something performative, how he had let the silence do the talking, how he had touched me like it didn't need to be acknowledged, because it simply was, like gravity or muscle memory or something older than both of us. Brian was still comparing prices when I interrupted to say I'd handle the car again next week, that it made more sense with my work schedule, and he nodded, without asking for details, didn't ask why I didn't want him to take it in, didn't ask if the issue had returned or if I needed help with anything at all. And it was in that moment, watching him wipe his hands with a kitchen towel and place it precisely back on the hook like misalignment would throw off his whole evening, that I knew I wasn't going to tell him. I wasn't going to say that the mechanic had touched me or that I hadn't asked him not to, that I had sat in the car and let it happen, that I had walked away feeling more alive than I had in weeks, maybe months, maybe longer than I was ready to admit. The next day I called the garage again, my voice steady, my tone casual, asking if they could take another look, and when Travis picked up and asked if it was the same noise again, I said yes, though this time I wasn't entirely sure the sound I was chasing came from the car. He paused and then said, "Are you sure you want me to fix it?" And this time, I heard it. I heard everything. That morning, I stood by the kitchen sink pretending to be focused on my coffee, swirling the spoon without aim while Brian adjusted his watch and checked the calendar pinned to the fridge, mumbling about grocery runs and HOA meetings, and I waited for the right pause to say what I had rehearsed in my head during the entire restless night, the line I had smoothed and reshaped until it sounded natural, just another concern from a cautious wife who cared too much about safety. So when the moment came, I let the words fall with practiced ease and said the car had a leak, not a big one, but possibly serious, that I smelled something last night after parking, and I didn't want to take risks with brake fluid or power steering or whatever it could be, and before he could suggest we look at it together or worse, take it to the dealership, I quickly added that I had already scheduled a checkup with the same shop, same mechanic, just a quick follow-up, no big deal. He barely looked up, just nodded and reminded me not to delay the emissions test if I wanted to avoid another fine, and I stood there smiling, nodding back, hiding the slight rush of guilt that passed through me like a static shock, because the truth wasn't in the leak or the fluid or the brakes. The truth was in the memory of heat and silence and proximity, and the way my breath caught in my throat when Travis sat beside me in the lifted car like he'd done it before or dreamed of it or maybe neither, but it didn't matter because I hadn't stopped him, and I hadn't stopped thinking about it either. As I slipped on my jacket and grabbed my purse, I noticed a faint dark smear on my wrist, a trace of something that smelled unmistakably like engine oil, and instead of washing it off, I left it there, brushing it lightly with my fingers as if testing whether it would stay through the day, as if part of me wanted to walk into that garage not completely clean, not completely detached from what had already started to form between the metal silence and the questions I didn't want answered too quickly. When I walked into the garage again, Travis was crouched under the hood of another car, his head buried in the shadows and his arms slick with sweat and grime, and this time he didn't say hello or nod or even glance my way, just motioned with a jerk of his chin toward the far bay where my car waited as if he knew I would come back without needing to be reminded or greeted, and I didn't mind the lack of welcome, because something about it made everything feel even more real, more like a shared understanding we weren't going to dress up with pleasantries. I sat on the edge of the service bench, pretending to scroll through my phone while my eyes followed the slow movements of his body as he moved toward my car, pulled the hood release, and leaned forward again, his hands busy with something I couldn't see but could almost feel. And when he finally spoke, it was without turning, just a low question asked into the engine. Same noise? I didn't answer right away because I wasn't sure how much of this was still about the noise, but eventually I said yes, softer than I meant to, and he nodded once without looking up, the kind of nod that said he didn't need more detail, that he had already diagnosed something else entirely. I stepped closer, pretending curiosity, pretending concern, watching his shoulders shift under the stained fabric of his work shirt, and then I said, maybe too lightly, "Want me to hold the light?" Though I already reached for the flashlight before he could answer, but he didn't speak, didn't object, just extended his arm slowly without looking away from the engine, and when my fingers touched his palm, something in me caught fire. Not from the pressure, but from the stillness, the pause, the quiet second where he wrapped his fingers around mine, just enough to be noticed but not enough to be explained. He let go a moment later, casually, like nothing had happened. And I pulled my hand back so quickly the flashlight tilted in my grip and bounced light across the engine like a strobe, and I laughed without humor to cover the tremble in my voice, muttering something about slippery handles before taking a step back and pretending to focus on the car again, even though all I could feel was the imprint of his skin against mine, like a brand I hadn't asked for but didn't want to erase. When he closed the hood and wiped his hands on the same rag I remembered too well, he turned toward me and opened his mouth as if he might finally say something, but then stopped, looked at the car instead, and said, "Tomorrow," in a voice so flat it almost broke my heart, then added, "It won't be ready today." And I nodded like a customer, like a stranger, like a woman who hadn't just had her fingers held for one long, forbidden second. As I left the garage, I walked slowly, not from hesitation, but from a strange need to keep feeling the floor under me, like grounding myself could stop the storm, rising in my chest, and when I reached the parking lot and slid into my backup car, I noticed the corner of my purse was unzipped slightly, and inside I saw a key, long, rusted, not mine, and I knew without checking that he had touched my bag, maybe on purpose, maybe by accident, but it didn't matter because the message was already delivered. At home that evening while folding laundry in the soft hum of the dryer, Brian asked me with that skeptical tone he used when he smelled something off in leftovers, "You sure? You went to the garage? I found your old Jack in the trunk. Thought I tossed it last spring." I froze for half a second, then smiled too fast, the kind of smile that always came when I had to lie quickly, and said, "You probably forgot." But the crack in my voice betrayed me, and he tilted his head slightly, not suspicious yet, but curious enough to make my stomach twist. And just like that, I had lied to him out loud for the first time. After Brian left the room with a shrug and the folded towels, I sat down on the edge of our bed, still holding a sock in one hand like it meant something, staring at the place where the wall met the floor, not because there was anything to see there, but because I needed somewhere to rest my eyes that wasn't a reflection, wasn't a mirror, wasn't the man I had just lied to without blinking, though everything inside me still trembled with the weight of that single broken truth that didn't sound like much until it echoed in your own voice, quiet but irreversible. I told myself it wasn't really a lie, not the kind that changed everything, just a convenient shift of memory, a gentle cover over something that didn't need to be uncovered because nothing happened. Not really, not yet, not in any way the world could hold up in court or even in a real conversation. Because all I had done was let a man touch my hand, let him glance at me longer than necessary, let his scent linger on my wrist long enough to wonder if it would mix with my own, or just sit there on the surface like evidence waiting to be found. That night I laid in bed beside Brian, staring at the ceiling as the fan rotated with mechanical calm, and I could hear his steady breathing, the peaceful rhythm of a man who had no reason to doubt the woman beside him, and I hated myself just a little more with every exhale, not because I had betrayed him yet, but because I was thinking in yets, thinking in maybes, thinking in what-ifs that curled around my ribs like ivy growing through cracked brick. In the morning, the oil smell was still faint on my wrist, dulled but present, and I pressed my nose to it while brushing my teeth, half expecting to find it gone and half hoping it would be stronger, like the kind of mark that didn't wash off just because you wanted it to, the kind that chose to stay until it had made its point clear. I drove back to the garage without music, without distraction, just the hum of the road and the steady rise of anticipation building in my chest like a second heartbeat I couldn't control, and when I pulled into the lot and saw my car parked just outside the bay, already washed, already waiting, I knew Travis had done that on purpose. Knew he had placed it there so I would see it from the moment I turned in, clean and gleaming like bait in the sunlight. I walked in slower this time, not out of caution, but out of something closer to ceremony, because everything about this return felt like a step deeper into something I could no longer pretend was innocent. And when Travis looked up from the clipboard in his hands and caught my eyes without looking away, I felt the same low throb in my stomach that I'd felt in the car, that low pull of heat and guilt and curiosity wrapped into something that didn't have a name but lived in the spaces between breaths. He didn't say hello, didn't comment on the weather or the car or the leak I'd invented to justify my presence again. He just watched me as I walked closer, and I let the silence stretch between us until I finally stopped a few feet from the front bumper and said, "You finished it?" He nodded slowly, eyes still locked on mine, then turned and walked toward the car without a word, popping the hood with one smooth motion, the way someone would open a letter they already knew the contents of, and I followed, drawn forward by something I didn't dare question anymore. He reached into the hood, pulled back a hose, adjusted a clamp, movements casual and practiced, and I stepped forward and said the line I had rehearsed last night while staring at the ceiling beside my sleeping husband. "Want me to hold the light again?" But this time, there was something different in my voice, something softer and more deliberate, and he paused for half a second before lifting his hand toward mine, palm open, like a question I hadn't earned the right to answer. Our fingers touched, again, slower this time, and when his hand closed around mine, it wasn't accidental or distracted. It was precise and intentional, and the warmth of it shot through my arm like a fuse being lit, slow and inevitable, and for a single second, that stretched out longer than it should have. We stood like that, connected by something that wasn't about the car or the noise or the flashlight. And when I finally pulled my hand back, it wasn't with panic, but with control, with the kind of shiver that comes not from fear, but from knowing you've crossed a line you told yourself didn't even exist. I smiled at him then, not a full smile, just a flicker, a private acknowledgement that we both understood what had just passed between us. And then I stepped back and said I'd be back tomorrow, even though he had just told me it was ready, because I needed to give myself one more excuse, one more breath before the world caught up with the choices I hadn't made yet. As I turned toward the exit, I heard his footsteps behind me, soft on the concrete, and I knew he was following, maybe to speak. Maybe to say something simple that would ruin the quiet we'd just shared, but he stopped by the car, picked up a rag, wiped his hands without looking at me and said, "Tomorrow," with that same voice he used before, not cold, but unreadable, the kind of voice that keeps a secret on the edge of its tongue. Back home, the day passed like static, filled with chores and half-eaten meals and moments where I caught myself checking the time, just to measure how long it had been since I saw him. And when I opened my bag to grab my phone, I saw the key again, old and unfamiliar, tucked in a pocket I never used, and I knew without question that he had put it there, not to frighten me, not to leave a message, but to remind me that he had been closer to my world than I realized. Brian came home late, dropped his briefcase by the door, kicked off his shoes with a tired grunt, and while we sat on the couch watching a show neither of us cared about, he turned to me and said, "You, sure you went to the shop? That jack's back in the trunk. I swear I tossed it out last spring." I froze, then turned my head slowly with a smile I had practiced only once before, the kind of smile that feels like it might crack your face open if you hold it too long, and I said, "You probably just forgot," in a voice that wasn't quite steady, and even though he didn't press further, even though he nodded and turned back to the screen, I knew he heard the tremor, knew it nestled somewhere in the silence between us like a shadow waiting to speak. The third time I returned to the shop, I didn't bother with small talk or pretense or any explanation that might dilute what was already written into the pauses. Between our glances, and as I stepped through the open bay door with the confidence of someone who had already made her choice in the quiet places of her mind, Travis didn't look up from the workbench or lift his voice to greet me. He simply pointed toward the far end of the garage where my car was already parked. Engine off, windows rolled down halfway, like it had been waiting for me in a space that existed outside of appointments or schedules or the polite structure that governed the rest of my week. Without hesitation, he walked ahead of me and motioned for me to follow, his steps slow and deliberate as he led me past the customer zone without a word about waiting areas or complimentary coffee, instead offering only a brief comment over his shoulder. "It's faster this way." And though I knew he wasn't talking about service times or mechanical procedures, I didn't ask for clarification. I just nodded and kept pace, letting my heels echo faintly against the concrete like a countdown I couldn't stop. When I slid into the driver's seat, the inside of the car felt smaller than I remembered, not physically but atmospherically, like the air had thickened with something invisible but heavy. And the moment he opened the passenger door and settled into the seat beside me, the entire space shifted into something quieter, denser, more charged than anything I'd experienced in a long time. Because it wasn't just the hum of machinery or the faint sound of metal clinking in the distance. It was the scent that hit me first, a low mix of plastic, old leather, faint engine grease, and a trace of cologne so subtle it felt more like memory than fragrance, and I had to close my eyes for a second just to keep my breath from catching in my throat. He didn't speak at first, didn't turn toward me, just sat back with one hand resting lightly on his thigh, fingers drumming once against the denim like a signal he wasn't sure he wanted me to hear. And then, almost as an afterthought, he said, "Want to hear how a real engine sounds?" And before I could answer or pretend confusion, he twisted the key, bringing the engine to life with a low rumble that felt more like a heartbeat than a machine, followed by a sharp flick of his wrist that turned on the radio, blasting static and music in the same breath before he twisted the dial again and silenced it all, leaving only the sound of the idling engine and the deafening quiet of two people sitting too close in a place built for travel but currently going nowhere. Then, the rain started, sudden and loud, hammering against the metal roof of the shop like 1,000 small fists pounding in rhythm, drowning out whatever ambient sounds had remained. And it created a kind of dome around us, isolating the car from the world outside, turning the inside into a cocoon where breath and tension and silence were the only things left that could move. And I turned my head slightly toward the windshield, but caught his gaze in the glass, already fixed on me, steady and unreadable, the kind of stare that isn't invasive but inevitable. I looked away first, eyes dropping to the dashboard, then to my hands clasped in my lap. But I didn't move, didn't shift or reach for the door or create space where none was offered, because part of me needed to know how long he would look, how close he might come before I pulled back if I even would. And when I felt the weight of his attention lean slightly toward me, I knew he wasn't acting on impulse but on intention, measured and slow and sure, as though he had memorized this path in his head, and was simply following the steps one by one. He leaned closer, not suddenly, but with the kind of control that made each breath feel like permission. And when his face was close enough for me to see the faint stubble along his jawline, the small scar near his temple I hadn't noticed before, the almost invisible rise and fall of his chest, I stopped thinking about what was right or wrong or expected and simply let my eyes close, not in surrender, but in readiness. We exchanged a brief, hesitant touch of lips, gentle and fleeting, as if testing the boundaries of a fragile connection, lingering just long enough to sense the uncertainty between us without crossing a line, until the tension became too much and the contact deepened, not rushed, but deliberate, a slow unfurling of something that had been building since the first oil-stained touch 3 months ago. And as his hand lifted slightly toward my face, not quite touching but close enough that I could feel the warmth of it in the air, I reached without thinking toward the door handle, not to open it, not to escape, but to press the lock button, the soft click of the mechanism sealing us inside like a secret kept between steel and sweat. The kiss deepened for only a few seconds longer, just long enough for me to lose the sense of where I ended, and he began, until the sound of a distant voice echoed from outside the bay doors, muffled by the rain but sharp enough to jolt us both, back to the surface like swimmers breaking through water, and we pulled apart instantly. Breath still caught somewhere between our lungs and throats, eyes darting but bodies frozen, and for a long moment we just sat there, silent, listening to the footsteps approach with the kind of stillness that only comes from people trying to disappear without moving. Travis was the first to move, slow and smooth, sliding out of the passenger side with the posture of someone who hadn't just kissed another man's wife in a running car inside his own shop. And he didn't look back, didn't speak, just walked calmly across the garage toward the voice as if this moment had never happened. while I stayed in the driver's seat, with both hands gripping the wheel, chest rising too fast, cheeks flushed, and breath so shallow I could barely feel the air coming in. I stayed that way until the footsteps faded and the sound of the rain softened, and even then I didn't move, because I didn't trust my legs to hold me yet, not after everything that had just happened in the space of a single heartbeat, and the decision that was no longer in the future, but already part of the past. The rain didn't let up as I sat there gripping the steering wheel, though I no longer registered the sound as anything more than a layer over the noise in my own head, because somewhere between the heat of his breath and the cold air settling against the back of my neck, I had lost track of what was happening outside, of time, of reason, of all the justifications I had rehearsed over sleepless nights in the bathroom, with the fan running so Brian wouldn't hear the pacing of a woman who didn't know who she was anymore when the lights were off. Through the fogged windshield, I could see Travis's back as he spoke to whoever had come in, another customer maybe, or a parts delivery, or just someone unlucky enough to enter at the exact moment we crossed the threshold between maybe and absolutely. And I watched the way he wiped his hands again on that rag he always carried, moving with the same unbothered calm that made him feel more dangerous than someone who shouted or slammed doors, because there was something about how he didn't panic that made it clear he'd done this before. Maybe not exactly this, but something close enough to know how to cover his tracks while mine were still fresh and clumsy. My skin was still flushed, still prickling with sensation I hadn't felt in years, not since before Brian's routines became law and his affection became itemized like our grocery budget. And I realized in that moment, still trapped in the car, with the echo of Travis's kiss lingering at the corner of my mouth, that I wasn't looking for passion or thrill or rebellion. I was looking for proof that someone still saw me not as a list or a role or a silhouette passing by, but as a body, a woman, a person capable of being wanted in ways that weren't useful or convenient. Travis didn't look back at me once while he spoke to the other man, and part of me admired him for it, because if he had so much as glanced over his shoulder, I might have crumbled under the weight of that attention and thrown the door open just to make the tension stop. But instead I waited, let the storm outside pass like a curtain over a stage, waited until I was sure the moment had passed before. I finally opened the driver's door with hands that trembled not from fear but from too many things happening at once. I didn't speak as I stepped out, didn't ask about the leak or the inspection or the fabricated issue that had brought me here in the first place, because none of that mattered now and we both knew it. And when Travis turned to look at me again, finally, directly, like a man, looking at someone not with apology, but understanding, I felt my breath hitch again even though my body was already retreating, pulling itself back into something that looked like composure. "I'll call you when it's done," he said, and though the words were plain, functional, nothing in them suggested what had just taken place in that car. His voice had changed just slightly, deeper, lower, like he was speaking in a tone reserved for afters, for aftermaths, for things that had already been tasted. I didn't nod or smile. I just turned and walked to my backup car again, the one Brian never asked about, the one that gave me a second alibi if the need ever came. And as I buckled myself in and pulled away from the curb, I didn't look in the rearview mirror, not because I didn't want to see him, but because I didn't trust myself not to turn back if I did. The drive home was short, but felt like crossing back into a version of myself that had already expired, and by the time I pulled into the driveway and stepped into the house, the smell of fabric softener and air purifier and lemon dish soap wrapped around me like a costume I wasn't sure still fit. And when Brian looked up from his laptop with that half-curious, half-distracted expression he always wore when I entered a room he hadn't prepared for, I said nothing, just dropped my keys in the dish and walked straight to the laundry room where I could breathe without explanation. Later that night, I stood in the bathroom brushing my hair longer than necessary, looking at my face in the mirror and searching for evidence of guilt, something visible I could scrape off like mascara or regret. But all I saw was a woman too still, too quiet, someone who had always thought betrayal looked like shouting and slamming doors, when really it could look a lot like someone holding a flashlight and not pulling away when their hand was taken. I pressed 2 fingers to my lips then, gently, experimentally, not to recall the kiss, but to see if it had left anything behind, and of course it hadn't. No smudge, no stain, no mark. But the absence of it was louder than any trace would have been, and I realized then that what scared me most wasn't being caught but never being touched that way again. When I climbed into bed beside Brian, the distance between us was the same as always, a polite gulf marked by pillows and the remains of old affection, and though he turned slightly in his sleep, murmured something I couldn't quite make out, he didn't wake, didn't notice the way my breathing faltered or the way I lay on my back with my hands crossed over my stomach, like someone waiting for judgment that hadn't come yet. And as the fan above whirred into its usual rhythm and the moonlight made silver lines on the wall. I knew this wasn't over, knew the next time wouldn't be accidental or silent or softened by distraction, because something had shifted inside the cab of that car, and it wasn't going back into its box no matter how many times I tried to pretend otherwise. The message arrived just after noon while I was sitting at the kitchen table pretending to review insurance renewal forms I had already filed. The sunlight pouring through the blinds, striping the wooden surface like the bars of a cage. I hadn't realized I'd built around myself until it was already closed, and when I saw the name on the screen, my hand hovered over the phone just long. Enough to feel the heat of hesitation before I opened it and saw the photo. My car gleaming like new, fresh water droplets still clinging to the polished hood, parked perfectly in the garage bay like something on display, and beneath it, the words that hit me harder than they should have. Come get your baby. Or do you just want to keep risking no brakes? I stared at the message for several long seconds, not because I didn't understand what it meant, but because I understood it too well. And my body responded before my mind could stop it, heart racing in that low, steady way that didn't feel like panic but like certainty, because there was no more pretending I needed an excuse, no more manufactured reasons or carefully built lies. This time I wasn't going to explain it away with a safety concern or a leak or a strange noise that wouldn't resolve itself. This time I went because I wanted to go, because I was ready for something I had already crossed into but hadn't named yet. I dressed without overthinking, choosing something casual but clean, not too deliberate, but just enough to look like I hadn't forgotten how to feel good in my own skin. And as I drove across town with the windows halfway down and the air sticky against my throat, I didn't rehearse anything because there was nothing left to prepare, nothing left to negotiate with myself or with the quiet voice that still sometimes tried to speak in Brian's tone, reminding me of responsibility and roles and all the years we had built a life that now felt like a shell I could still see, but no longer live in. When I pulled up to the shop, the front gate was already open, and Travis stood just inside it, leaning slightly against the metal frame, arms crossed, wearing a clean set of coveralls that hadn't seen grease or grit, the navy fabric pressed and smooth, his hair tied back for once, pulled away from his face in a way that made me pause, because it was the first time I really saw him without distraction, saw the lines around his eyes from squinting into the sun, the scar under his jaw I had missed until now, and the way he smiled without showing his teeth but still made me feel like I'd been noticed in full. He didn't wave or say anything as I stepped out of the car, just waited until I was close enough to hear him say, "It's all yours now. Just wanted to give her a final check." And though his words were directed at the vehicle, we both knew they weren't only about the machine. They were a signal, a confirmation, a quiet way of saying the time for tiptoeing had passed, and the line we'd touched before was about to vanish completely. I nodded and smiled, not because I had to, but because I couldn't help it, because there was something in the way he looked at me that didn't demand anything, but still pulled everything forward. And when he gestured toward the car, already unlocked, already waiting, I walked to it with legs that didn't hesitate this time, opened the driver's door and climbed in without speaking, without stalling, just letting myself move like someone who'd finally stopped pretending they were lost. He opened the passenger side but didn't sit there, instead moving to stand by the open door, leaning in slightly with one hand on the roof, asking in a voice low enough that it felt like a challenge more than a question. "Want to test the suspension one last time?" The words hit me like a switch flipping somewhere deep in my chest, not because they were crude or bold, but because they were exactly what I had hoped to hear. And without answering, I moved closer, without hesitation, settling beside him with a calmness that belied the intensity beneath. And when he placed his hands gently on my sides, I lowered my head until our faces nearly met, sharing a kiss that was certain and unguarded, as if a boundary had been quietly crossed. The heat in the car rose quickly, not from the engine but from us, from the breath between us and the friction of skin through fabric and the way neither of us spoke because words would have only cheapened what was already unfolding in silence. And when his hand reached behind me to roll the window down just a few inches, I let my head tilt back, trying to breathe, trying to slow the pounding in my chest, trying to find a grip on something solid when everything suddenly felt suspended. Again. And then the sound came. A door slamming shut somewhere outside the garage, sharp and out of rhythm with the quiet storm building between us, and I froze instantly, my whole body going rigid against him as my heart dropped into my stomach and I pulled slightly away, still straddling him, but now caught in that suspended moment of uncertainty that always comes right before something breaks, and I saw it in his face too. The shift, the recognition, the fear edged with familiarity. Footsteps echoed on the concrete and then a voice, familiar and unmistakable, steady and too calm. "You left this in the trunk." I turned my head slowly and saw him, Brian, standing just inside the garage door, holding a small cardboard box with both hands like it weighed nothing, his posture casual but his eyes already scanning the scene, not missing the open windows, or the steamed glass, or the way I sat too still in the driver's seat, too far forward, too exposed. Brian stood at the edge of the garage, the box in his hands steady, his expression neutral in the way that only someone used to suppressing emotion could manage. And in that first second where time fractured just enough to make everything slow down, I couldn't tell whether he had come here by chance or had followed some instinct he hadn't wanted to acknowledge until it placed him directly in front of proof. Not spoken or confessed, but visible and undeniable, hanging in the humid air, between my stillness and Travis's body beneath me. I didn't move. Not right away, because part of me believed that if I stayed still enough, the moment might pass, might close around itself like a wound that never broke the skin. But I felt Travis's body tighten beneath mine, not sharply, but subtly. A shift, in breath and posture that told me he knew this couldn't be undone, that whatever we had been playing with had now bled outside of its boundaries. And he slowly placed his hand on the doorframe, steadying himself as though he expected something to fall. Brian didn't raise his voice, didn't throw the box or storm forward like a man caught in betrayal was supposed to. He simply stepped further into the space with calm precision, each footstep echoing through the open bay like the slow drip of a faucet in a silent house. And when he stopped beside the hood of my car and set the box down gently, I noticed that his wedding ring was still on, clean and bright and too tight, on the hand that had once learned the shape of my back in the dark. "You left your umbrella," he said finally, his voice so level it didn't sound like his. And when I looked at the box, I saw it really did contain just that. My small floral-patterned umbrella with the bent handle and the frayed edge I never replaced, now resting carefully inside a box too big for it, as though the gesture needed framing, needed space around it to say what he wouldn't. Travis hadn't moved, not once since Brian entered, and when I finally found the strength to shift my weight off of him and slide back into the driver's seat properly, the movement felt like peeling off a second skin, like stepping out of a version of myself that had already begun to harden into something irreversible, and I kept my face angled slightly away, letting my hair fall just enough to shadow the worst of the truth. Brian stood still, not blinking, just watching the car, watching the details, the seatbelt not fastened, the open window, the way my hand gripped the steering wheel even though the engine was off, and the way Travis now stepped slowly out of the car, his expression unreadable but his jaw tight, his eyes never leaving Brian's face as he moved around the front of the car like a man stepping into a storm he had seen coming from miles away. "I didn't know anyone else was scheduled this late," Brian said, his eyes flicking to Travis now, not accusatory but factual, like a question wrapped in an observation, and Travis nodded once, not apologizing but acknowledging, his hands now wiping themselves clean again on the same rag, slower, this time more out of habit than necessity. "I was finishing up," Travis said quietly, not defensive, not evasive, just offering a truth that didn't explain anything but also didn't deny it, and Brian nodded again as if that confirmed something. As if all the space between what he saw and what he suspected had just collapsed into silence. He turned toward me then, not fully, but enough for his eyes to meet mine, and for a moment he didn't speak, didn't blink, didn't look angry or betrayed or even surprised, just sad in a way I hadn't seen before, like someone watching a photograph fade from the inside out, knowing they couldn't stop the loss no matter how long they stared. "You're flushed," he said softly, his eyes narrowing just slightly as he scanned my face. "Are you all right?" The question was disarming not because I didn't expect it, but because it was the exact one he would have asked 5 years ago if I'd come home from a run or a frustrating day at work, and the way he asked it now, with no edge, no sarcasm, just concern, hit me harder than any accusation could have. I nodded, too quickly, too stiffly, and said, "It's just hot." My voice too thin to carry weight, too weak to hide the crack, and I hated how I sounded, like a girl caught sneaking out, not a woman who had made a choice with her whole body just minutes ago and now couldn't even speak it aloud. Brian didn't say anything else, just glanced at the box one more time before turning to leave, his steps measured and slow. And when the door closed behind him, it felt like the final punctuation to a sentence I hadn't realized I was writing until it was too late to change. I sat in the car for another full minute, listening to the sound of Travis breathing beside the open passenger door, not looking at me, not speaking, just waiting for me to move. And when I finally reached for the gear shift, my hand was shaking so badly I had to grip the wheel again just to stay grounded. He didn't stop me, didn't ask if I was okay, didn't offer comfort or excuses or even the promise of more. He just closed the passenger door gently and stepped back, letting me pull out into the fading light with my engine too quiet and my heart too loud. And as I drove home past rows of identical houses and carefully trimmed hedges, I realized that no matter how it ended, nothing after this would ever feel quite real again. Because I had been seen, not just caught but seen, and there was no part of me left untouched by it. I had barely slept the night before, tossing in tangled sheets that clung to my legs like reminders of everything I was still hiding, listening to the low hum of the refrigerator in the dark kitchen, the occasional passing car outside sounding louder than usual, as if the world itself was waiting for something to happen, and by the time. The morning light slipped through the blinds in fractured slivers across our bedroom wall. I already knew I was going back to the garage. Not because I believed the car needed more work, but because I couldn't stand the silence between me and Travis that had lasted longer than I expected, stretching out like a wire pulled too tight, and I needed to know if it was still there. That thing between us, that current, that breathless place where we both stopped pretending. So I told Brian I needed to follow up on the front end alignment, that the steering had started to drift again, that maybe they didn't torque the suspension properly, and he didn't question it. Didn't even lift his eyes from the sink where he was rinsing his coffee mug with the same precise circles he always used, just nodded and said to keep the receipt, as though our life had been reduced to invoices and routine exchanges. And I left the house with my heart racing and my stomach tight, telling myself it was just to clarify something mechanical, but already knowing I had worn perfume that I never used on days I planned to stay clean. When I pulled into the garage, Travis was already outside tightening a bolt on the wheel of a white truck, his sleeves pushed up and grease streaked lightly across his forearm, and he didn't smile when he saw me. Didn't say anything right away, just wiped his hands once, set down the wrench slowly, and motioned for me to drive around the side. And the moment I passed him, I caught the edge of his voice through the open window, low and steady, saying, "Back one more time, huh?" And even though it sounded like a joke, I knew it wasn't. Knew it was his way of asking if I'd made a decision I wasn't ready to speak aloud. Inside the garage, he didn't ask me to wait. In the customer area, didn't point to the clipboard, didn't offer any official language or pretense, just walked to the lift and tapped the button without looking back, and I followed, locking eyes with him only once as he stepped away to make room for the rising car, and in that glance I saw everything I'd been trying not to admit. The acknowledgement of what we both knew, of what we had already started. And I didn't hesitate this time when I climbed into the cabin, sliding into the passenger seat and waiting with my hands in my lap, like someone who already knew what came. Next, the engine was off, the garage quiet except for the faint metallic ticks of settling tools. And when he climbed in beside me, not with urgency but with the slow confidence of a man who had already crossed the threshold, he didn't speak, just looked straight ahead, letting the silence wrap around us like a curtain falling between acts. And I didn't ask what we were doing because I already knew. And when I reached for his hand and placed it gently on my knee, without a word, he didn't flinch or move or ask if I was sure. Just let it rest there, warm and steady, his thumb moving slightly in a slow arc that sent a pulse through my spine. I turned to face him, and for the first time, I didn't think about Brian. Didn't think about guilt or consequences or the sound of a name said in anger. I just leaned in and kissed him, not carefully this time. Not like someone asking permission, but like someone who had already opened the door and stepped through, and his hand slid behind my back, pulling me closer across the narrow space until I was on top of him, knees bent awkwardly against the center console, the steering wheel pressing into my side, and none of it mattered. Not the discomfort, not the risk, not the noise the lift made under our shifting weight, because in that moment I wasn't pretending to be anyone else. The kiss deepened and his hands gripped tighter, and my breath caught in my throat as the world around us narrowed to the heat between our bodies and the sound of my heart slamming against my ribs. And then, with no warning, the garage door swung, open behind us with a heavy clang that shattered everything like glass on tile. And before I could even lift my head or pull away, I heard his voice, calm and cold and unmistakable. "Rachel." The single word hit like a brick to the chest, and I froze, still straddling Travis, my hands still on his shoulders, my mouth parted but no sound coming out, and Travis didn't move, didn't flinch, just turned his head toward the sound with the slow precision of someone who knew the cost of what had just happened. Brian stood at the bottom of the lift, wearing his navy suit and holding a manila envelope in one hand, his tie slightly loosened as if he'd come from the office but hadn't stopped to think. His eyes locked on me, not furious, not panicked, just quiet. And that silence was worse than shouting because it meant he'd already understood, had already run through every possibility, and landed on the only conclusion that made sense. "I found the policy forms in your drawer," he said evenly. "Figured you'd need them." He tossed the envelope onto the hood of the car, the papers inside sliding out slightly as they hit the metal, and I still hadn't moved, still couldn't breathe, and he turned without waiting for a reply, walking back across the garage and out the door without looking back once. The moment the door closed behind Brian, the garage felt too big and too silent, the echo of his footsteps still bouncing off the walls like the sound hadn't yet settled into memory. And I sat frozen on top of Travis, my spine stiff and my hands numb, every part of me pulsing with the sick weight of reality folding in like the ceiling had just cracked open, and for several seconds I didn't move, not because I didn't know what to do next, but because I already did and I hated myself for how long it took to act on it. Travis didn't speak, didn't pull me back in or offer some slow apology. He just sat still beneath me, his hands no longer on my hips but resting at his sides, like he understood the damage wasn't something that could be touched. And when I finally lifted myself off his lap and sank slowly back into the passenger seat, the air between us thickened into something bitter and irreversible, because what had once felt like a shared secret now sat between us like a broken plate on the floor, shards everywhere, no way to step without bleeding. I stared straight ahead, trying to collect the pieces of my breath, my hair clinging to my cheek, and my pulse still racing from more than just the kiss. And Travis opened his mouth once like he might say something, but then stopped, rubbed the back of his neck, leaned forward slightly like a man weighing what to repair first when the foundation had already cracked, and finally spoke in a voice I didn't recognize, softer and lower than usual, like shame had dulled the edges of who he was. He knew, he said simply, the words flat but certain, like he wasn't guessing but confirming something I hadn't wanted to admit. And when I looked at him for the first time since Brian had left, I saw it in his eyes. The flash of realization, the cold truth that this moment hadn't been spontaneous or bad luck, but something that had been building from the second we let ourselves believe we were in control of any of this. I nodded. Once. Not because I agreed, but because he was right. And the silence between us felt different now. No longer electric or charged or full of possibility, but heavy like wet wool. Like the aftertaste of something we had swallowed too fast and were only now realizing had been poison all along, and I opened the car door with a shaky hand, stepping onto the lift platform barefoot because I had kicked off my shoes somewhere between breathing him in and losing myself completely. The metal beneath my feet was cold and unforgiving, and as I stumbled toward the edge, I saw the envelope, still sitting on the hood of the car, the corner of one sheet fluttering faintly in the draft from the still running fan, and I hated how clean Brian's reaction had been. How quiet and composed and surgical, as if he had rehearsed this ending, for days, maybe weeks, waiting for the moment he would finally confirm what he already suspected. I bent down and picked up the envelope, not out of shame but out of habit, folding it back together like restoring order could undo the damage. And when I turned to leave, Travis called my name, not loud, not pleading, just enough to make me stop with one foot already on the concrete, and I stood still, waiting for a sentence that never came, for an apology or an explanation or even a curse, but he just stood there with his hands in his pockets and his shoulders hunched forward, like a man realizing too late that even the strongest arms can't hold back consequences once they're in motion. Outside, the air felt thinner, sharper, like the light had shifted into something colder, and I walked across the parking lot with the envelope pressed to my chest and my heartbeat louder than the passing cars. And when I reached my backup car, the one Brian still didn't ask about, I sat inside with the engine off and stared at the empty passenger seat where nothing waited for me, the smell of oil and heat still clinging to my skin like a memory I hadn't asked for. That evening, Brian didn't come home. There was no message, no missed call, no dramatic confrontation, just absence, quiet, deliberate, final. And I sat at the dinner table staring at the plate I had prepared out of habit, steam curling from the food I no longer had an appetite for. And when I finally got up to clean, I realized I had washed his coffee mug without thinking, the one with the chipped rim he never wanted me to replace. The next morning, a courier delivered an envelope addressed in Brian's handwriting, and inside was a typed letter, short, precise, like him, stating that he had spoken to a lawyer, that things would move forward quickly, that I could keep the house if I wanted it, that he would not contest anything, that he wished me peace but no longer trust. And as I read it standing barefoot in the hallway where we used to leave our shoes together, I felt the finality of those words strike me harder than any scream or slammed door. At work, they asked if I was okay, and I said yes, too quickly, too brightly, because there was no space in polite conversation for the kind of implosion I had lived through. And when I returned home that evening, the garage felt like a museum of mistakes. The car parked where it always had been, but no longer meaning what it used to. I walked into the garage alone, closed the door behind me, climbed into the car I had once used as an excuse, and sat there for almost an hour, breathing in the scent of things I couldn't untangle anymore. And for the first time in days, I cried, quietly, without shaking. Just tears tracking down a face that no longer belonged to someone who could be surprised by the way everything she'd known had turned to ash. The garage was silent when I stepped inside after work, no longer humming with the faint background, noises of tools clinking or a radio mumbling an old country station, and I moved through the space like someone entering a chapel where the service had long ended, but something sacred still lingered in the air. Only this time the scent wasn't comforting or familiar. It was heavier than before. Not the raw mix of motor grease and iron and worn rubber I had grown used to, but something sharper, more metallic, something that clung to the inside of my throat like a truth left unsaid for too long. And when I opened the door to my car and sat in the driver's seat, I didn't feel the cold leather or the curve of the steering wheel under my fingers. I only felt the heat of shame settle into my chest like smoke curling under the ribs and refusing to leave. Brian hadn't come home after that day, hadn't called, hadn't left so much as a note or message, and when his absence stretched from a night into two and then turned into silence, measured only by the unopened envelope from his lawyer on the kitchen counter, I stopped pretending I didn't know what was coming, stopped hoping for some explanation or confrontation, because what he gave me instead was distance. And in that distance was the clearest answer of all, that he had decided to leave me without drama, without pity, without offering me even the brief comfort of anger I might have earned. And now I was left alone in a house that no longer smelled like him, with rooms that still had his folded shirts and drawers that still held receipts from our last vacation, but not a single trace of warmth. I tried to go back to work as if nothing had shifted, told myself that routines were anchors and I could still find some version of myself inside the spreadsheets and the clatter of coffee mugs in the break room. But when I caught myself typing the wrong date 3 times in a row and realized I hadn't eaten anything but crackers in 2 days, I knew I wasn't fooling anyone, not even the receptionist who offered me a tight smile and a leftover granola bar without asking questions. And when I finally walked into the garage that evening and smelled the lingering trace of oil and his cologne in the corners of the car, I understood that it wasn't the car that changed. It was me. Travis had vanished without a message, without a word, without even closing the chapter we had written with our mouths and hands and breath in that suspended space above the shop floor. And though I had tried not to think about it, tried to pretend that I had moved on, I found myself returning to the garage anyway, not to check the car or fix anything mechanical, but to sit in the driver's seat, close the door, and wait for the silence to do what it always did, wrap around me like a second skin, one that no longer fit but was still the only thing I had left. The car still started when I turned the key, but I didn't drive anywhere, didn't even roll the windows down. I just listened to the idle and the faint clicking of the cooling engine as though those sounds could translate into answers. And when I opened the glove box to search for tissues, my fingers touched something unfamiliar, a folded piece of paper that hadn't been there before. Not thick or official like the documents Brian left, but thin and plain, as if written quickly, maybe in the last moment before leaving. And when I unfolded it with hesitant fingers, I saw his handwriting, clean, slanted, almost careful in a way that surprised me. The note was short, no greeting, no name, just one line written without flourish. If you're reading this, you came back alone. So did I. I read it once, then again, and still didn't move, didn't react, didn't cry or smile or tear it up like I had seen women do in movies, because nothing about this felt scripted or clean or even finished. It just felt like an open window during a storm. Too late to close, too early to walk away. And I folded the paper carefully, placed it back inside the glove box, and closed it as gently as if it might break. Then I turned off the engine, opened the car door, stepped out into the garage barefoot because I hadn't planned to stay long, and stood there for a long moment, breathing in the space that had once been filled with want and movement and the sharp clarity of choice, but now only echoed with the dull ache of consequence. And I realized the car no longer smelled like oil. It smelled like the space between two mistakes, like hands that didn't know where to go now, like endings we refused to say aloud. That night. The house felt colder than usual when I stepped inside, the quiet pressing against my skin like a weight I wasn't sure I could carry. And as I hung my coat on the hook by the door, I caught a faint scent. Not Brian's cologne, not Travis's work oil, but something stale, like regret settled deep into the fabric of the curtains, the cushions on the couch, the air itself. And I realized that no matter how hard I tried to scrub the past away, the shadow it cast had already soaked into every corner of my world. I went to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water, the ice clinking softly against the glass, but the cold didn't reach beyond my lips, and when I sat down at the table alone, I felt the absence of his chair opposite me like a hollow drum, the space so vast it swallowed every thought I had left, every word I wanted to say but couldn't find, every feeling I was still trying to understand. My phone buzzed briefly on the counter, a message from an unknown number that I almost ignored, but something made me look, and there it was, a simple text. If you need anything, call. I'm still here. No name, no explanation, just the ghost of a promise that hung there like a thread I wasn't ready to grasp. I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the keyboard, unable to type a response or delete it, caught somewhere between wanting connection and fearing what it would cost. And I knew then that the story I had been trying to close was still unfolding, still writing itself in moments like this, fragile and raw and impossible to ignore. The next morning, I found myself driving without a destination, the road stretching, ahead like an empty page waiting for something to be written, and for the first time in weeks, I let myself breathe without holding back, windows down, the rush of wind filling the car with a kind of freedom I hadn't felt in a long time. As I drove past familiar streets and forgotten places, I realized that some parts of me had changed forever, that the lines between right and wrong had blurred, into shades I was still learning to see, and though I didn't know where I was going, I knew I couldn't stay where I was. When I finally pulled into an empty parking lot and shut off the engine, I sat for a moment, hands resting on the wheel, feeling the weight of the choices behind me and the uncertainty ahead, and I understood that this was no longer about a car or a mechanic or even a husband who had left. It was about reclaiming myself from the pieces I had scattered along the way, about learning to live in the spaces I once feared, and about finding the courage to keep moving, even when the road was unclear and the scent of shame still lingered in the air around me.